I'm Cliff Ribner, and I'm going to talk to you today about public sector employee unions. That means government workers who are members of unions. As it is, even though the only real economy, what they like to call it the private sector, as if the public sector contributes anything to the economy. In the private world of real companies that do real business and selling services and goods to other people and producing them, only maybe 5.9% of the employees are members of unions. Real employees don't want unions. They recognize that the presence of a union is poison. What the union does, it pretends that it represents the workers. That's Marxist language for employees. And what happens in real life, the union has its own existence. The unions have always been run by Marxists. There's never been a time in American history when the people actually running the union, elected by the other people, elected by the members, but they were the ones running it, the ones with the power in the union. They've always been Marxists, and they've had a Marxist agenda in this country. But at least with private employers, they can't impose it on the rest of us. They weren't even legal until what's called the Wagner Act. I think it was in 1933. It was part of Roosevelt's New Deal. They basically were illegal under all state laws because every state has a tort. It's called the tort of tortious interference with contract. The whole function of a union is to interfere with employer and employee contracts. That's what they do. They dictate, they end up pretending to represent the employees, but they represent their own interests. They get paid. They get a piece of the action. And they're under Marxist ideology, what they're doing is forcing the employer to disgorge illegal profits to the employees as much as possible and enhance the employment experience as much as possible. It can't do the second of those two. The employee, and it can't do the first either, because the money that the union extracts, a lot of it goes to itself. They get dues. And in this country, a big chunk of those dues end up going to the Democrat Party. But at least with private sector employees, it doesn't have a political impact. And employees have shown they don't want a union. They don't want to have a union. 5.9%. That tells you right there. Every time they come up for a vote, like it happens several times with some of the automobile manufacturing plants, they get rejected. They want to keep running. And the law is stacked very heavily in their favor. Once they're there, it's very hard for the employees to get rid of it. But 5.9% tells you exactly their value to real employees. Now, with government employees, they were completely illegal. Everybody recognized that it would violate the entire operation of the business. FDR, who was a progressive before he called himself a liberal. By the way, the reason he called himself a liberal was because previously, as a progressive, like all progressives, he was in favor of prohibition until it actually got enacted. Prohibition was the 18th Amendment forbidding the government or forbidding individuals from buying and selling alcohol. It was nuts, but they actually did it, and the country lived with it, and the effect of it was to enrich the mafia. Organized crime became really organized and got really rich during that, and it made everyone absolutely miserable, and that's why it was finally repealed with the 21st Amendment. Anyway, he called himself a liberal because he changed his mind about prohibition. He was in favor of getting rid of prohibition. So compared to all the other progressives, and unfortunately the Republican Party, which was silent about the whole thing, he became a liberal because he was opposed to prohibition. That was the only thing he was actually liberal about. In all other respects, he was a dyed-in-the-wool progressive. And what that term has always meant in America, it's simply the Marxists' word for themselves in America. They don't want to call themselves Marxists, and they're not in favor of using violence to impose Marxism. But that's what they want, is Marxism. They believe fundamentally that individuals shouldn't have the right to their own property. The government should be able to dictate who gets what. That's literally what they believe in. And they believe the government should control everything. And that's what all of these administrative agencies do. Anyway, Roosevelt got the New Deal passed, and in 1933 there was a thing called the Wagner Act, which legalized unions. And it was the first time they were legal. There had been unions before then, but they were not really legal, and there were all sorts of ways people could fight them. And they created enormous tension in businesses. Anyway, it was there was labor disputes. It happens that the economy, a lot of it was because there was an influx of immigrants who were only able to do very simple jobs in many cases. A lot of them didn't speak English. So we had a huge influx into the employment market prior to the 1920s. So there was a shortage of employers relative to employees. That created a supply-demand problem where everything was heavily in favor of the employers. As if the economy had just been permitted to grow, we would have lived beyond that, because that's what happens. There would have been more employers than employees, and so there would have been a shortage of employees. That's what happens when you just let things go. Unions interfered with all of that, but lots of things did. There was lots of legislation that interfered with that. In the federal government, they created these agencies which slowed down the economy, made it harder for businesses to operate. And beginning in the 1930s, they started putting burdens on employers as employers, things they had to do just because they were employers. Anyway, FDR was absolutely opposed to public employee unions because he recognized that the whole nature of the beast was different when it came to the public sector, because the elected officials would be dealing with the union, but the elected officials were supposed to represent all the people. The union would just basically be a lobbying group. He didn't use that term, but he said it was simply not possible to have collective bargaining. And he was right. There's no profits to force the distribution of. That's the way he thought of it. That because all the money the government has is taken in taxes from the people, there are no profits to distribute. And the elected officials have to have complete rights to dictate what price they're willing to pay for government work. Nobody's forcing the people to work for the government. But they have to have all of the rights governing all the terms of the employment, and the people running the government have to be in charge. There can't be an additional lobbying agent with special powers. That's, in effect, what a public employment union is. And what it is, these public employee unions, they're run by the most radical Marxists, and they always have been. And what their interest is it's not the public employees, but they have a political interest in what they're doing in dealing with the government, politically forcing the hand of the government to do Marxist things. They're interested in changing policy. They don't really represent the workers. And only 32% of public employees are members of the public employee union. They still have to pay the dues, they don't have to pay the dues that are attributable to political contributions, but a huge portion of their dues goes to political contributions, virtually all to the Democrat Party. So there is a political dimension to these things. They're not just beneficially represented the interests of the public employees, and the public employees should not have rights in the sense that private employees do. It's a completely different situation, and they are the greatest menace in the country right now. Anyway, FDR said they should be illegal, although, strangely, at that time, the Tennessee Valley Authority was owned by the government, and it recognized the union. There was a lot of pro-union activity in the 1930s of all kinds. Anyway, the TVA recognized the union, and they entered into a contract with it, and Roosevelt did not oppose it. So he would, in that sense, you could say he was inconsistent, except he may have seen the TVA is basically doing a private sector function in his terms, even though it was owned by the government. So it wasn't really acting as a government agency in that sense. And that may be why he didn't have a problem with it. Because otherwise, on the rare instances when he talked about public employee unions, he was very clear that there was he actually said there was no need for them, and that they simply couldn't function in a proper way. And one thing he had in mind is a problem we have right now in many states where the legislature when it negotiates with these public employee unions, agrees to pensions. Now, the nature of it's a defined benefit pension where the money that the employee is basically guaranteed a percentage of his salary when he retires. So it's a burden on future administrations. And that means that you have politicians elected today burdening future treasury outlays. That's completely unconstitutional. It's called the dead hand rule, and it's part of our Constitution. It was recognized by the Supreme Court in the Winstar case. And what that is, whoever is in office today is not allowed to affect future Congresses or presidents, and whoever was in office previously is not allowed to affect what people in office today do. Now, Congress breaks this rule all the time, but it happens to be unconstitutional for that to happen. And it's a very bad thing because it means people can make promises today that they don't pay for. And that's what these pensions do. If they're guaranteeing all this money in the future, so they don't have to pay them as much now, but they're burdening future administrations, which means burdening taxpayers in the future who didn't vote for them. Anyway, that's one example. But what happens is these unions basically end up taking over the state because they have so much power, because they basically are negotiating with politicians who they control, people whose campaigns they have funded. So it's a completely impossible situation. There's nobody representing the actual taxpayers at the table when they negotiate. And they have caused terrible damage. The teachers, basically, they were illegal. Other than in Wisconsin, Marxist, farm later progressive, whatever they called themselves, began to recognize a union in 1959. But it was only when Jack Kennedy signed an executive order making them legal for federal employees, although he didn't permit them to strike. They're not allowed to strike. But he did permit federal employees to form a union and to bargain collectively. That was the first time that was ever permitted. And what happened was after he did that, practically all the states, I'm not sure if there's a single state that didn't end up following suit and permit the local, like the teachers union, all the different public employees to form unions. And in the states where these unions are the most powerful, one of the things that they do is the union forces people into the union whether they want to be in it or not. If you go to work someplace, you're in the union if there's a union, and it's very hard to get rid of them. So there's all kinds of laws in many states and in the federal government that weigh the whole thing heavily in favor of the union. The union is given all sorts of powers, even though fundamentally it's illegal and unconstitutional. And so what it is, once the government jumps the shark and permits things to happen that shouldn't happen under the Constitution, things get out of control. And the union, the public employee unions in particular, are the worst example of that. And the teachers unions have completely ruined the public schools. There was no teachers unions, or they existed, but they had no power. They couldn't do anything until the states began to recognize them. And that happened after Kennedy did that executive order in 1962. And since then, the schools have just gone completely downhill. And the amount of money that gets paid per student has gone up so dramatically. There are states and cities where union employees are paid over $100,000 a year for not working that hard. But anyway, and they're given all these pensions, all sorts of stuff. And the worst thing is they can't be fired. In New York City, they have what's called rubber rooms, where teachers who've done horrible things are sent because the cost of firing them in legal fees for the city is so high that it's cheaper to just pay them their salary and just keep them out of the classroom from doing damage. And these teachers that are in there these are people that should never have been hired in the first place, and they ruin the schools. But what's happened is the teachers unions basically have taken over public education in this country. They were the ones behind keeping schools closed during COVID. Nobody else had that kind of insistence on keeping schools closed. And in fact, the students were never in any danger at all. The likelihood of someone under the age of 18 dying from COVID, other than someone with multiple comorbidities, was virtually zero. These people had no risk, or the students had no risk, and they were treated horribly. That alone should convince everyone to get rid of the teachers' unions. And that can be done at a stroke of a pen. All that needs to be done is those executive orders permitting them just need to be revoked. But they have ruined the schools. All you have to do is look at the actual performance. It's gone downhill. It reached its high watermark in terms of performance by students on measurable tests in 1969. And it's gone downhill since then. And the cost per pupil has gone up so dramatically. And there are many states where it's $50,000 a kid. It's literally cheaper to send them to private school, or it approaches private school tuition. And one way to deal with it, obviously, other than getting rid of the teachers' union, would be to have universal choice, where the parents get to pick any school they want, and the money that's going to be spent on that kid just follows the kid. That would be the best solution. But if we got rid of the teachers' unions, it would change the whole thing, because it would disempower the Marxist element in the schools. The schools have basically become Marxist indoctrination centers. They don't teach them reading and writing. Universities in the country have had to dumb down their entry requirements because students graduating from the schools, from the regular public schools, can't do the work. And this is true of the most elite, supposedly elite schools of the country. Now, they have problems with the quality of their students coming in also because they've been slaves to DEI, and they've been insisting on not taking white students. Stanford has been bragging that its entry class for the last few years is only 9% white males. Now, white males, even if you just went by percentages, 70% of the population is white. So that is an underrepresentation of white males. Stanford's been bragging about that. And we don't know that percentage for all the schools, but that's a very elite school, maybe the most elite, certainly as elite as any school. And they're bragging about that. That tells you all you need to know about whether they are actually looking at merit. And basically, there's been a hostility to meritocracy. And that has come largely from pressure from the teachers' unions. And the teachers' unions promote every left-wing cause. Hatred for America. They don't teach love of America in those schools anymore. When I was in public school, that was we were taught that. There were civics classes, and we were taught to love this country and honor it, and to honor the dead who died for us in wars, and to honor the men who formed this country in the Revolution. And we had a Washington's birthday where we really noticed that, and we had a Lincoln's birthday now there's President's Day. They don't even say which president it is, as if they're all the same, as if Washington and Lincoln are no different from the rest of them. Anyway, the teachers' unions have been the single most destructive force in this country from within, and it's been an absolute poison. They're unconstitutional. FDR was absolutely right, and Kennedy gave in to pressure or whatever reason he had for doing that executive order. It was a terrible thing, and it needs to be undone. I'm Cliff Ribner, and if you like what I have to say, please like this video, watch my other ones, and go to my website, cliffordribner.com, and read my book, Freedom's Last Stand. Thank you.